first and foremost, we're a business, and every business faces the same set of challenges. Coming up with a great concept, resourcing that concept, making sure production is consistent, and then managing the business side, everything from employees to taxes and whatever else have you. So that being said, I think that in this season, as we prepare to celebrate Juneteenth, as we look back on commemorating the Tulsa incident, what most people don't realize is that because you've had the setbacks of the racial history in this country, many people who may just start a business don't realize they're starting a business having had families who have had the opportunities throughout the 1800s to current day to have somebody who may have started a business or benefited from investments or passed along something of tangible value. African American experience, by and large, in this country has been that whenever strides were made to acquire that which is the American dream, the systemic state, federal, local, social, cultural norm has been to push back, dispossess, or as in Tulsa, totally destroy. And I think that understanding that reality, and again, this is not a polemic. This is not this is not trying to beat on anyone over here. This was history and it was fact. So if we treat it like you treat science as we look at the coronavirus, it's just science, it's a fact. You start from there and you realize that the development of generational wealth, not just of money, but of knowledge and perspective, simply doesn't exist. So in our case in particular, my grandfather raised 10 kids working for Firestone originally. It was a Firestone plant in Memphis before they closed. And that was in the day when the restrooms were black, white, and colored. He continued to work to support his family despite all of the obvious issues you run into, and especially as we moved into the civil rights era. And he proceeded to start his own business doing plumbing. But he could only do plumbing in the black community. The idea of going to a bank and saying, I want to open a plumbing supply house was absolutely unheard of. The idea of getting capital to expand and create a crew was not something anyone could even consider up until you got to 68, post Martin Luther King assassination. My mother then became one of the first generations who had access to what they called white collar jobs. We call it white jobs. So she was actually brought into the local utility company, what was considered a high paying job, but it was a clerk entry level job. It's this level of social constriction, if you will, that we live out today. So hypothetically, had my grandfather been able to fully develop his business then, and his sons, my uncles, and my father had been able to follow through and have access to the same level of resources, I wouldn't come to Vermont where the resources are there, the opportunities are there, but my understanding of how to navigate those has taken me 20 years to learn, because there was no wealth of knowledge nor a wealth of resources to make that jump.
And not to mention mentorship too.
And mentorship.
Yeah, mentorship is huge.
It's
because
huge.
When you start a business, there's so much that you don't know.
And you don't know you don't
and
know.
you don't know that you don't know. And there's so much to navigate. And I think for the people of color, what happens is that because most people of color do not come from means, they do not have the resources of finding mentors, or they don't even know how to find mentors, or they don't even know that they actually need a mentor. So I think it's a mentorship for anybody, for especially for businesses of people of color, I think the mentorship would be a huge.
It's a huge necessity.
Yeah, it's a huge necessity.
If you can recognize that there is a pre-existing gap, again, in wealth resources and information and knowledge-based resources, perspective, even resources in the Black community, and therefore target that community to say, hey, we want to make sure you guys know the Rural Sustainable Jobs Fund is here. Center for Women in Entrepreneurship is here. Green Mountain Economic Development, all of these groups. And so, letting people know that they're here, and even really spending an extra moment to communicate that there are not as many barriers as you may think to taking advantage of these resources. And if there are barriers, say, hey, how do we target minority communities, communicate that there are no resources, and then make sure we've done the background work to reduce or eliminate as many barriers so that we can get people in here having these conversations to talk about, if you have a business idea, we're going to help you think it through. Does this make sense? And then get you on a path to finding resources if you're going to do it. And Vermont did such a great job handling the pandemic. But let's talk about the management of them increasing vaccination rates in the BIPOC community. We were contacted, or we were put in contact with the NAACP in Brattleboro that was running their outreach program there, which made us aware, and kind of blush to say that I didn't even know that NAACP was here in Vermont. I mean, I had heard rumors, and I was like, well, I guess maybe. But actually to see an organization engaged in the community doing something, and once again, it was not something we can do now, but I put it on my list of, when we get past this point, I'm going to make it a point to reach out more to that group, to the NAACP, and say, hey, what can we do as a part of the community to get more involved with what you're doing to, just make people aware of some of the great opportunities in Vermont. And it might be nothing more than, being able to just let more people know about the business support resources and things that can be done, because the infrastructure is here. And it really is just a matter of how do you get it to the people, immigrant communities, minority communities, and other people who may not be able to as readily catch it from the mainstream media resources. The country loses has lost trillions historically from the loss of revenue from bottlenecking of African American creative resource and possibilities. So in other words, by having policies like redlining and all the other things that have gone into keeping, one group of people from being able to expand themselves, that we've lost trillions historically. When they started forcing integration, a lot of the majestic pools and public resources that had been built during the New Deal program, the New Deal post-Depression. So they built all these great swimming pools and all this public infrastructure throughout the South. When they were forced to integrate it, many a town filled in their swimming pools as preferred to integrating. Literally filled in 100-yard swimming pools, just filled them in and bulldozed it, as opposed to integrating. And therefore, the whole bent towards lack of government resources towards infrastructure has its roots in a decided policy of defunding and dispossessing everyone of a public good for the sake of keeping Blacks from having access to that public good. And that's documentable. That's just documented history. Unfortunately, it has taken the level of carnage with everything from the Michael Browns and the George Floyds and the Breonna Taylors and everything else to bring us to this inflection point where, obviously I'm not saying anything that the average person of color living in the U.S. would find surprising. But what has happened is that more mainstream white allies, people that you typically don't talk to about deeper things, have begun to see these truths of our American system and structure. And don't get me wrong, I am a very pro and proud American advocate. I've traveled the world. I've seen what a lack of a transparent press and the consolidation of power into tyranny. I know what it looks like, and it's not pretty. We've got so many good things going for us that if we can, as a group, as a set of conscientious people across races, come to the conclusion that our history has imbalances, those imbalances can be addressed. But we have to acknowledge the truth of the policies that we fight with now that are rooted in racial segregation and denial of opportunity. And part of that is telling the story, being able to celebrate Juneteenth, being able to acknowledge the Tulsa Race Massacre and the hundreds of other racial massacres and riots that have occurred throughout this country's history, the dispossession of land across the board. If we can acknowledge those truths and recognize that some form of reset must occur so that those generational losses can be made up, and so that lack of wealth, that lack of knowledge, that lack of understanding can be addressed. And again, Juneteenth is part of that celebration, realizing that a whole group of people felt that they were still in practical slavery, physical slavery, because the politicians and everyone around them did not want them to know they were free, because that had implications for how well they could be manipulated by the system that was in force at the time. And so it really is a knowledge game. It really is a understanding game, and it's one that African Americans and people of color know somewhat, mostly, but we also have to have so many members of the broader community that also know and recognize that what we're asking for is not a question of racial preference, but a way to address how do we get fairness and equity that we've all spoken about. And I love the way Martin Luther King put it when he said, if he was in Russia or China, he wouldn't complain because they never said that they were, committed to values of justice and, morality and all the rest of these things. Our system has committed itself to a set of values, and we have to make that promise of value whole across the board and address the systematic dispossession of those values to a particular group or groups. It's not just African Americans, Native Americans, the indigenous populations. So there's so many groups that have been a part of this sweep that now is a great time to take history on and say, we can correct this starting today. And it doesn't take big things, but there's small things that can be done that lead to bigger things that allow us to really bring about equity where we are on the playing field, where we're talking about, the generational opportunities are there, and we can start to recoup that, which was lost.
I think, for me, I think it still goes back again, the issue of, knowledge and, mentorship, and just being aware that there are gaps, and how do we close the gaps, and can we close the gaps by making resources available in terms of, whether it be, creating centers that can be able to help people, especially when they start businesses, because we do know that businesses, it's business, and there are basic things that you can start doing, the businesses and schools, especially, catching kids, in the school system, and just being able to create opportunities, teach them that they can be entrepreneurs, because I think that's where most opportunities lie.
I'm very hopeful for where we are in this moment of history, where we are in the state of Vermont, and where we are going forward across the board as a nation. I think we've got a lot of opportunities, and we hope to be a part of, just really talking to them, getting people to think about diversity and difference as a starting point for better connection and more of a global, inclusive jump off point.
And learning from one another.
Exactly.
I think we are better off together than, that's why we are global village,
Better together.
Yeah.